Today, I am going to tell you a story. A story that is critical to so much of Disney's history, but is largely unknown. After Walt Disney died, the Disney Company was in limbo. It had lost its creative leader, and without Walt's vision, Disney was stagnant. From animation to studio to parks, profits were down and Disney was lost. But enter a Hollywood outsider, corporate powerhouse, and the man who's heralded as remaking Disney, and then almost destroying it. Because this is not just a story of the golden CEO who saved the company. It's a story of ambition and power and feuds. This is the story of Michael Eisner. I'm Mouselet1, and for today's Mouselets Monday, we are diving into a topic that's really critical for understanding the modern era of the Disney Company. And that is the rise and fall of Michael Eisner as Disney CEO. I feel like in so many deep dives that I do, I reference Eisner and his vision for the company. But the lore behind Michael Eisner is actually so deep, and he's far more of a controversial figure than many modern Disney fans realize. So let's jump into this story. When Walt Disney died in 1966, his brother Roy took over as CEO. But Roy was notoriously not the creative mind that Walt was. He had always been the practical one, managing operations and finance. And between his takeover in 1966 and his own death in 1971, Roy really focused on finishing Walt's dream of building out his Florida project, what later became Walt Disney World. And that meant that Roy was leaving other departments to pretty much run as best they could, including the animation department. So Walt died in 1966. In 1967, The Jungle Book, which was the last animated film that Walt had worked on, released. And as Walt's films typically were, it was a huge success. But it would be Disney's biggest animation success for the next 2 decades. Because without Walt at the helm, animation began to really struggle. In fact, Disney actually largely abandoned the department, focusing instead on live action. Animation staff declined from over 500 down to 125, but despite this massive downsizing, only 21 new hires were made between the years of 1970 and 1977. And in 1970, when the Aristocats released, which was the first post-Walt animated film, it was said that, quote, the absence of Walt's hand was evident. Although I will say, I love the Aristocats, so I think that's a bit of an unfair take, but regardless, it was the take at the time. So animation was very much in flux, but the rest of the company was as well. Its live action films were forgettable. The parks were not expanding in an ambitious way, and leadership didn't seem to have a defined vision. And while Walt was obviously irreplaceable in ethos, at the end of the day, someone did have to replace him as that creative visionary. So things kind of continued along with Roy at the helm, but in 1971, Roy passed away as well. And after his death, Don Tatum, the company's former president, became the first non-Disney family member to become CEO. And a man named Card Walker replaced Tatum as president. Not a ton to say about these two other than the fact that Tatum was a lawyer by trade and Walker was a businessman. And both of them valued conservative, steady, incremental growth, which was fine. They kept the company profitable, but Disney had been known for its creativity, and that creativity was pretty much gone. And Disney's board recognized that. And so after over a decade of this, they knew that something needed to change, and they turned to the Disney family. Roy E. Disney, aka the son of the original Roy O. Disney and Walt's nephew, had been deeply entrenched at the company. He'd worked there 23 years. But he'd left in 1977 due to frustration with the company's creative and strategic direction, and this shakeup was happening in the early 80s. Although even if Roy still had been at the company, he probably would not have been looked at for such an executive role. Roy was known for his creativity, as well as his quality control and his loyalty to Walt's original vision. But he was not seen as a strategic business leader who could manage both studio and theme park growth simultaneously. So instead, the board turned to Walt's son-in-law, aka the husband of his daughter Diane, a man named Ron Miller. Ron Miller actually had a background playing football for the NFL, but after an injury, he'd left and joined Disney in the 1960s and worked his way up through the ranks. And so as a member of the Disney family, he was seen as someone who was tied to Walt's legacy, but would potentially be willing to inject some new energy and creativity into the company. And so Ron Miller became the president in 1980 and then the CEO in 1983. And he wasn't ineffective. He created a studio called Touchstone Films to create more adult-oriented content, and he launched the now famous Disney Channel. But he was largely seen as being what people called at the time rudderless, meaning he kind of lacked an overall vision. His high-cost film flops were leading to financial strain, and he wasn't able to turn around the woes of the animation department. And most importantly, he was too inexperienced to be leading such a large large publicly traded company. Disney stock was actually trading at such a low value at the time that outside investors and what are called corporate raiders tried to seize control of the Disney company through what's called a hostile takeover, which of course went against the wishes of Disney management and the Disney family. And a lot of that was unfortunately caused by some of Ron Miller's mismanagement. But throughout this time, Roy E. Disney was still there watching from the sidelines. Even though he had left as someone who was actually working at the company, he was still one of the company's largest shareholders and elected to return to the board, alarmed by the overall company direction and the ongoing threats of a hostile takeover. And he decided that enough was enough. So he partnered with his financial advisor Stanley Gold and another board member named Sid Bass to organize a shareholder revolt against Ron Miller. And it worked. In 1984, the board removed Miller as CEO and replaced him with the star of our story, Michael Eisner. Well, that's not 100% true. They replaced him with the star of our story, Michael Eisner, and a man named Frank Wells, with Michael Eisner acting as CEO and Frank Wells acting as president. So who were these two? Michael Eisner was a TV executive who'd spent most of his career at ABC before becoming president and COO of Paramount Pictures. And during his tenure at Paramount, he produced tons of hits, like the movie Grease or the Indiana Jones film Raiders of the Lost Ark. And a large part of that success was thanks to Eisner's hands-on, aggressive, competitive spirit. He would read every script, rewrite dialogue, and argue marketing campaigns personally. His colleagues often described him as a, quote, control freak with incredible instincts. Because to Eisner, movies were not art, they were business, and he excelled at that business. But in 1984, when Michael Eisner's mentor and the chairman CEO of Paramount Pictures left, Eisner expected to get that position, but he was passed up, and Eisner was furious. But at the same time, the once great, now stagnant Walt Disney Productions was looking for a new CEO, post Ron Miller's ousting. And so Eisner saw his opportunity to run a studio like he always wanted and began lobbying aggressively. Eisner met with Roy E. Disney and other board members, promising to restore Disney's creative legacy and expand its reach. He spoke their language, but also his own, the language of profitability, synergy, and brand expansion. And Roy E. Disney was impressed but weary because Eisner was not a typical, quote, Disney person. He was a New York executive with a Paramount mindset, far more comfortable with edgy content and market strategy than Walt had ever been known for. But the company was desperate to find someone that had a vision, and Eisner had that covered. In fact, it would go on to become one of his greatest strengths. But Eisner was not known for his business discipline, financial caution, or calm temperament. And Roy E. Disney knew that the company needed both creativity and stability, aka a Walt Disney and a Roy Disney. So Roy E. Disney and his supporters found a man named Frank Wells, a former Warner Brothers executive. Wells was a Rhodes Scholar, Yale-educated lawyer by trade who was known for being measured, detail-oriented, and diplomatic, aka the opposite of the high-energy, impulsive Eisner. And so these two were brought in together and they became legendary as partners. Eisner was the showman, charismatic, hands-on, and bold. And while his temperament was entirely different than Walt's, he filled the shoes of Walt Disney in that he had a true creative vision for the company. And just like Roy Disney, Wells was the quiet backbone. He was the man behind the scenes, handling business negotiations, budgets, and strategy meetings. And so, as Eisner took over as CEO, he laid out a very simple vision. Disney should dominate entertainment, not just make family films. He wanted blockbuster films that would compete with the likes of Paramount and Warner Brothers, a revitalized animation studio capable of producing hits like Walt once had, expansion of the theme parks, including international parks, and synergy across all divisions, film, TV, parks, and merchandise, all feeding each other's success. And spoiler alert, this strategy worked. When Eisner first walked into Disney headquarters in Burbank, the company was worth about $2 billion, which may sound like a lot, but actually was a shadow of its former self. But within a decade, under Eisner's leadership, the company would grow more than tenfold. This era is known as the Disney Decade. And it was truly Eisner's vision, along with the quiet stability brought by Frank Wells, that made this possible. So let's dive into how. To start, there's another incredibly important character in this story, a man named Jeffrey Katzenberg. Katzenberg had been a close colleague of Eisner's at Paramount, and when Eisner became CEO, he brought Katzenberg over to be chairman of Walt Disney Studios, meaning that Katzenberg was to take over all live action and animation productions. And at that point, the animation department was in shambles. The feature film in development at the time was The Black Cauldron, which, side note, is one of very few Disney movies that I've never seen. And that movie was not only over budget, it was actually already considered outdated because of its refusal to use any computer animation techniques which were emerging at the time. And in addition to the fact that they were working on what ultimately would become a flop of a movie, the animation department had literally been exiled to a warehouse in Glendale. But luckily Katzenberg came in and he made immediate radical changes. First off, he demanded better stories. And Katzenberg was known to personally review scripts in excruciating detail, often literally line by line, making sweeping edits and sometimes even ripping out pages during meetings. This is a good time to note that Katzenberg had a reputation for being very tough and very abrasive, unconcerned with ruffling feathers as long as he got results. And he did get results because he understood story structure in a way that few executives did. To Katzenberg, every scene had to either make the audience feel something or drive the story forward. If it did neither, it was gone. Katzenberg also insisted on faster production schedules. Under the old system, Disney would release a new animated film every 4 to 5 years. Katzenberg wanted one every year, a pipeline that could sustain momentum and keep audiences engaged. And Katzenberg cut costs and tightened budgets. Some projects that had been languishing in development for years were killed outright, while others were reworked to appeal to wider audiences. And perhaps most importantly, Katzenberg brought modern commercial sensibilities to a company that was kind of stuck in the 1950s. He didn't just want to make family movies. He wanted to make blockbusters. And Katzenberg also understood something that had been largely forgotten since Walt's death: the power of marketing. He pushed for star-studded voice casts, pop music tie-ins, and cross-promotional campaigns that made each movie an event. And his first major triumph was The Little Mermaid in 1989. It was the first Disney animated film in decades to capture both the magic and the profitability of a classic Walt Disney movie. And with its Broadway-style songs, The Little Mermaid marked the beginning of what would be known as the Disney Renaissance. So Katzenberg doubled down on that formula. Beauty and the Beast, released in 1991, became the first animated film ever nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. Aladdin was released in 1992, a huge hit, largely thanks to Robin Williams' incredible performance as the genie. And The Lion King, which was released in 1994 and personally championed for by Katzenberg, became the most successful hand-drawn animated film of all time. So during those years, Disney animation wasn't just revitalized, it became the heart of the company again. But that wasn't all Katzenberg did. He refocused the live-action division, using the Touchstone Pictures brand to release iconic films like Good Morning Vietnam, Dead Poets Society, and Pretty Woman. He and Eisner launched another brand called Hollywood Pictures, which allowed them to further expand Disney's output, release even more films aimed at teens and adults, and increase the studio's overall market share. And by the early 90s, when independent films were booming, aka smaller, riskier, more creative movies that could earn critical acclaim and Oscars, Katzenberg knew that Disney had the money but not the indie credibility. So he helped orchestrate the purchase of Miramax Films, run by Harvey and Bob Weinstein. Yes, that Harvey Weinstein, although this was years before the scandal would break. That acquisition gave Disney access to smaller budget prestige films, like Pulp Fiction and Good Will Hunting, as well as awards recognition and critical acclaim, something that Disney's safe image couldn't always earn. And lastly, Katzenberg recognized that computer animation was the future of movie making. And after seeing a short called Tin Toy made by a studio called Pixar, he was hooked. So he garnered a 3-movie deal with that studio that would ultimately lead to the blockbuster hit Toy Story. So studio was thriving, but what about the parks? Before Eisner, Disney parks were largely standalone experiences. Magic Kingdom and Epcot both relied on general themes rather than tying to specific Disney films. But when Eisner became CEO in 1984, he had a very clear vision. Disney should leverage its movies to drive the theme parks, rather than treating theme parks and movies as two separate entities. He saw untapped potential in the parks and wanted them to feel like stepping into a Disney movie, making the parks a marketing arm for films and vice versa. And this approach was really unprecedented in scope, because he wasn't just expanding the parks. He was designing an ecosystem where movies and merchandise and attractions all fed one another. And Eisner brought us so much parks expansion. As someone who is first and foremost a Disney Parks fan, I have to say, Eisner may be my CEO simply because of how much he was able to accomplish in the parks during his tenure. And despite his downfalls, of which, yes, there were many, his contribution to the parks simply cannot be overstated. Disney's MGM Studios opened in 1989 as a hybrid concept, half theme park, half working studio where guests could experience films being made while also riding attractions. And this was Disney's first park to explicitly connect Disney intellectual property to park experiences on such a large scale. Think the Great Movie Ride, Tower of Terror, Star Tours. And that set the blueprint for parks and attractions to come. Eisner is actually famous for this. We've talked about it before, but one famous example is that Splash Mountain got its name because Eisner wanted to use it to promote a completely unrelated film about mermaids called Splash. Eisner also wanted to diversify the theme park guest experience and move visits beyond just a single day. So he opened new resorts like the Grand Floridian and the Boardwalk and made Disney's first foray into water parks with Typhoon Lagoon. And then came international expansion. Eisner believed that the Disney park should be globalized, bringing the brand and films to new markets. So he set out to build Euro Disney, aka what we now know as Disneyland Paris. And for the most part, with an asterisk on Euro Disney, which we'll get into later, Eisner's tactics worked. His film park integration drove massive attendance, increased profits, and cemented Disney as the ultimate immersive storytelling company. And so by the end of this so-called Disney decade, in 1994, it seemed like Eisner had created the perfect system. Creative freedom plus corporate structure plus synergy. But in 1994, everything changed after Frank Wells tragically died in a helicopter crash. Suddenly, Eisner was without his partner, and more importantly, his stable, level-headed other half. And despite the seemingly unstoppable momentum that Disney had from the first decade of Eisner's leadership, there were cracks beneath the surface, and those cracks were beginning to show. To start, after Wells' death, Jeffrey Katzenberg believed that he was the obvious choice to step in as Eisner's number two. In addition to turning around the entire studio division, he had just overseen The Lion King, a film that he'd personally championed and became the most successful animated film in history. But remember, Michael Eisner was a very competitive man, and he had begun to see the abrasive and aggressive Katzenberg as not a partner, but a potential rival. He resented Katzenberg's growing power and publicity, and ultimately refused to promote him into Wells's position. And Katzenberg was furious by this. He saw Eisner as increasingly ungrateful and erratic. And Eisner did not react well to this reaction from Katzenberg. He began stepping into studio decisions to override Katzenberg, and he purposely blocked him from receiving bonuses and other financial rewards for his successful films, particularly for The Lion King. So just a few months later, in August of 1994, Jeffrey Katzenberg left Disney. And he actually went on to become one of the founders of DreamWorks, launching what would become one of Disney's biggest direct rivals. So not only was Disney left without its extremely successful studio head, and with a new competitor being run by that very same studio head, it also got hit with a massive lawsuit filed by Katzenberg against Disney. Katzenberg claimed that Disney had denied him promised compensation from the animated films that he'd successfully overseen, including bonuses and profit sharing. And this turned into a nasty legal battle in which Disney ultimately settled for $270 million, one of the largest settlements in the entertainment industry at the time. And all of this did not bode well for Eisner. His leadership style and ability began to be scrutinized by the board, and unfortunately for him, this was not his only clash. In 1995, he made what was considered a shocking move to bring on Michael Ovitz as the president of the company. Michael Ovitz was an agent, one of the most powerful in Hollywood. He had a reputation as a master deal maker and had represented some of Hollywood's biggest stars and directors. So his arrival signaled a potentially transformative era for Disney. In fact, on paper, Ovitz was actually a perfect second in command. He had the connections, the clout, and the business acumen to elevate Disney's already expanding media empire. But almost immediately, Eisner and Ovitz's personalities clashed. Eisner was incredibly controlling and again, extremely competitive, accustomed to being the undisputed architect of Disney strategy. And Ovitz, used to commanding respect in the agency world, resisted being a subordinate and therefore openly challenged Eisner in meetings, in deals, and in the public perception. And so within just 14 months, Eisner orchestrated Ovitz's removal, and it did not happen quietly. Ovitz's severance package was a whopping $140 million, the largest corporate payout of its time. And this truly wild payout became a symbol of Eisner's ego-driven management style, one where personal loyalty was demanded, dissent was punished, and mistakes were paid for at an extraordinary cost. And remember that deal that Jeffrey Katzenberg had worked on with Pixar? It was falling apart due to friction between Eisner and Steve Jobs, who was the head of Pixar. Steve Jobs, protective of Pixar's creative vision and the long-term strategy of the company, frequently clashed with Eisner over profit splits, merchandising rights, and the public narrative surrounding Pixar's films. And this point in particular was problematic. Because remember, Eisner had an ego and a need for control. So in public interviews, he continually tried to assert Disney's dominance in the partnership, which really wasn't true. And this caused a lot of friction with Steve Jobs. The 3-movie deal did continue, but Eisner strained the relationship so badly that Pixar considered walking away. And that partnership was never fixed under Eisner's leadership. It was actually the next CEO, Bob Iger, who stepped in just in time to save it. But we're jumping ahead a bit. Disney's own in-house animation began to falter under Eisner's watch. The post-Disney decade-era films like Atlantis, Treasure Planet, and Home on the Range were ambitious projects with high budgets and creative risk, but Eisner's interference and lack of coherent vision ultimately killed them. His tendency to micromanage and insist on control undermined the creative teams, leaving directors frustrated, storytelling to be uneven, and projects disconnected from what audiences actually wanted. And in fact, after the smashing success of the previous decade from an animation perspective, the next is largely considered a flop in Disney's history. And it wasn't going much better in the live action department either. In one particularly concerning call, Eisner tried to shut down the production of Pirates of the Caribbean because he'd been disappointed by some early footage of Johnny Depp's performance. That movie, of course, went on to become a massive hit, earning more than $600 million worldwide, so the company is lucky that he didn't succeed. And on top of all that, remember that little asterisk that I mentioned about Euro Disney? Well, it turns out that in the years after it opened, Euro Disney was a financial disaster, largely due to cultural missteps that alienated European guests and caused low attendance. The story of Euro Disney and Disneyland Paris really needs its own entire Mouselets Monday deep dive, but for now, the important thing to know is that Disney lost hundreds of millions of dollars on this project. And it definitely called Eisner's risk-taking approach into question, especially when coupled with everything else that we just discussed. So, Eisner was unraveling. His rise to stardom with the Disney decade was definitely over. He no longer had his partner Frank Wells, and his unchecked ego was beginning to cause massive problems. And internally at Disney, frustration had reached a boiling point. Key creatives across animation, parks, and studio were leaving, stifled by Eisner's micromanagement, which had once been heralded as bold and visionary, but was now widely perceived as autocratic and inflexible. And at this point, it was the late 90s, early 2000s. This internal chaos had been building and building for years. But despite it, Eisner did continue to expand Disney's empire. He made huge acquisitions like ABC, ESPN, and the Muppets. On the parks and resort side, he oversaw the opening of Disney's Animal Kingdom in Florida, California Adventure in Disneyland, although that one does have a bit of an asterisk, and the launch of Disney Cruise Line. And these moves cemented Disney's brand dominance, creating new revenue streams and expanding their cultural footprint. But they came at a significant cost. That rapid expansion strained relationships with talent and key executives who were already unhappy with Eisner's management style. The asterisk of California Adventure is that it was considered yet another failure, which was particularly problematic after the failure of Euro Disney. And so all of this led to the return of our favorite company watchdog, Roy E. Disney. As we saw in the 80s, Roy E. Disney had long acted as the company conscience, quietly advising the board and holding leadership accountable. And so, in 2003, he decided that he would publicly challenge Michael Eisner. He launched a campaign that he called Save Disney, where he called for structural and leadership changes in the highest levels of the company, meaning he wanted Eisner out. He criticized Eisner's micromanagement, the departure of key talent executives, the mishandling of critical partnerships like Pixar, and the questionable corporate decisions like the hiring and subsequent payout of Michael Ovitz. And again, he did not just launch this campaign in the boardroom or within the Disney company, he launched it publicly. And the reaction from shareholders was historic. In a move virtually unheard of for a major corporation, 43% of Disney shareholders voted no confidence in Eisner during the 2003 annual meeting. And that was not just a symbolic gesture. It was a clear message to Eisner that investors, the public, and internal executives at the company were frustrated by his leadership. In fact, they were more than just frustrated. They no longer believed in or trusted his ability to lead at all. And this meant that the man who'd been credited as saving Disney in the 80s and 90s now had a threat to not only his authority, but also his entire legacy. And it was that campaign that marked the beginning of the end for Eisner. Soon after, he would announce his retirement and Bob Iger would step in as the new CEO, a transition that ultimately allowed Disney to repair strained relationships, refocus its creative output, and recover the innovative momentum that had defined its past, all while leaving behind the massive turmoil caused by Michael Eisner. And so when we look at the story of Michael Eisner, it's really twofold. Because Michael Eisner was hugely successful. No matter what may have happened, in the end, Michael Eisner left behind a stronger Disney thanks to his aggressive vision. But in the end, it was his own aggressive personality that was his downfall. And Eisner has a very interesting legacy when it comes to the public perception, because as I said earlier, a lot of Disney fans, especially diehard parks fans like myself, look back at the Eisner years with fondness. Disney would not be the Disney that we know today without him. And it is undeniable that he brought huge, massive hits in both the animation and studio departments, as well as across the parks. His innovative spirit as CEO is really the most like Walt that we've had since Walt's passing, and that makes it hard to necessarily dislike him. But when you look at the second half of his term, you can see the massive problems that he had with ego and competitiveness. He was actually sort of known to be a paranoid person who would make friends with people and then later turn his back on them because he saw them as threats. And this does not work at the CEO level. So the story of Michael Eisner is really a cautionary tale. And it's really an amazing lesson in leadership styles and learning about what does and does not work. Anyways, if you like Disney history, facts, secrets, and lore, follow us because we release deep dives every single Monday. And we also have our podcast Sisters for a bit of lighter Disney chit chat. For now, thanks for listening to me tell one of my ultimate favorite Disney stories, and we will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.